Welcome to A Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. My name's Mark Evans, Director of the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis, and your host this morning. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Mark.
I must admit I found it quite difficult focusing on Australian politics this week, what with the World Cup and the rescue attempts in Thailand.
That was an incredible story, or is an incredible story.
Yes, and it's going to go on for probably several weeks still. But despite that, I was sort of jolted to attention around the David Leyonhjelm incident, which I found really interesting as well, because obviously he's been accused of misogyny and sexism against Senator Sarah Hanson-Young. But what was most worrying was his counter, in which he said, I quote, "This was abuse and not sexist abuse. This is a normal Australian behaviour." Well, should we think this is a normal Australian behaviour? Should he be made to apologise for his comments?
Well, firstly, I think it's certainly not a normal Australian behaviour, and most people, not everybody perhaps, not the extreme minority, but most people would be pretty appalled by this sort of behaviour, as they should be. Now, in terms of an apology, I personally think that the Senate, when it resumes next month, should indeed say to Senator Leyonhjelm that he ought to apologise. I don't think he would necessarily take any notice of that, but I think it's important for the Parliament to send out a signal about what it considers acceptable and not acceptable from its members.
Of course, the sort of devil's advocate would say, well, this is bringing attention to what he's done, and then you have to have this balance there between giving attention and obviously being clear about what is acceptable conduct.
That's right, and there's been a bit of a debate in the media about whether he's got too much media attention. This started in the Senate, but of course then spilled over into interviews, and they became even more of a problem. Nevertheless, it's obviously a significant story when two senators are having this sort of argument, and it brings into question community standards, parliamentary standards. So I think the attention argument has to be kept in that sort of perspective.
I mean, again, it was interesting, his comments where he talked about his constituents finding his behaviour acceptable. And when we reflect on a survey that we conducted last year around trust and democracy, we found that 60% of Australians were very critical of the standards of honesty and integrity amongst elected politicians in Australia, rating them very low or low. So it seems that the Leyonhjelm incident underscores that problem. So do you think there's a need for real concerted parliamentary action here, beyond just insisting on a in other words, is this a broader problem?
I think it's a broader problem. It's the extreme end of a broader problem of bad parliamentary behaviour, and it does contribute to people's disillusionment with politics and parliamentarians. However, I do think that in terms of reaction, it has to be kept in proportion. The Senate should express its view, but I think that calls for expelling him from Parliament, even if that was possible, I don't even know whether it would be possible, but I think that goes way beyond common sense and proportionate reaction. We're not in that sort of territory, but certainly the Parliament should say, this is not what we stand for.
I mean, ironically, he's actually on the Senate Joint Committee that focuses on parliamentary conduct.
Well, they could have a rather robust discussion behind closed doors, couldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's go to a major policy issue. The government released a plan on Thursday to reform the GST formula to ensure that it provides a more equal and equitable distribution across states and territories. Now, obviously, there's been a particular problem there with Western Australia because, of course, the mining industry tends to distort that equation. How far do you think is the government's proposal influenced by politics rather than good policy?
I think it was substantially influenced by politics, because the WA members have been screaming about this. The government is not polling well in Western Australia, and it has several seats at risk, including that of the Attorney General, Christian Porter.
Yes.
But the result has been that the government has said, well, we must fix this up, and it's done that by a new formula, but also by tipping more money into the pool, because what it didn't want to do was fix up the problem for Western Australia and have other states screaming, especially in the run-up to an election. So it's greased the wheels by saying, here's a new formula, and by the way, here's more money. And it does seem, from the reaction of the states, they'll have some quibbles about detail, but their general reaction has been pretty positive. So I think it's solved a political problem and actually a substantive problem.
Yeah, so he's achieved a delicate balancing act there.
I think so, yes. And the money involved, which goes to about $1 billion annually after quite a few years, is frankly not that much.
Now, if I can ask you as well about the National Energy Guarantee. We spoke last week about Tony Abbott seeming to lose ground on his attempts to undermine the government's energy plan. And he delivered a major attack on the policy this week and called for Australia to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, is he determined to press on, even though it appears that he's isolated in the Liberal Party?
I think he is. He's taken up this cause, and he's just being relentless in making his points, using every opportunity. He had a big lecture this week and used that to canvass his doubts about the National Energy Guarantee, and, as you say, go to the edge by saying pull out of Paris. His colleagues, I think, are quite frustrated in the main by his behaviour, because they just want this issue settled. They know that business wants certainty, that we're not a long way from an election, and they need to have a coherent policy when they go to the people, and really there's nothing else on the table that's credible. So Tony Abbott's not doing himself much good in the party by his behaviour. His followers are very few in number, but it's not deterring him.
I mean, it's interesting that the Nationals are now pushing the government for a plan for coal, which is really interesting historically, because we know in the 1990s that the case for coal was sort of undermined, particularly in Europe. But latterly, coal has come back onto the energy agenda in Europe, with Germany leading the way in terms of coal investment. Do you think the Nationals will make any ground on the case for coal?
It's hard to judge. It's a minority of Nationals who are making this push, and they're quite determined, quite vocal. My feeling is that the government probably will not accommodate this, certainly not in any big way. I can't see any sort of subsidy for a new coal-fired power station, but the debate still has some way to go. Josh Frydenberg, the minister, is going to go to Queensland soon to try and sweet talk the Nationals. We'll see what comes out of that. But certainly I think that this energy debate is proceeding to a settlement, but still is some way from landing that settlement, and it's going to be quite a rigorous few weeks for the minister as he leads up to a meeting with the states in August.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Mark.
Well, that brings us to the end of our time together this week on a Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. We look forward to talking with you again next week.